Hi. So I changed my title back to the title that um Anthony gave me, which is just thinking about what are the big uh, knowledge gaps that we have in our understanding of ecosystem structural responses to pulse environmental change, extreme events, and disturbance. And I want to thank the organizers of this workshop. It's been really great so far. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that you don't mind me imposing my worldview on you for just a little bit, but that's what I'm going to do, and hopefully something of interest will come out of it. So to set the stage, first I'll just talk about how global change drivers are both presses and pulses, and I know these concepts have come up already in the first day with Anthony's introduction talk, but I thought I'd reorient everyone and then also just let everybody know kind of how I think of them. So press is what I refer to as a chronic alteration, and it can be either directly or indirectly of resources. And so global change drivers, like I'm showing here in this figure, we know all of these are happening. We're getting an increase in nitrogen over time, increase in carbon, and CO2 in temperatures. And these are all resulting in an increase in resource availability and impacting ecosystems globally. And because they're occurring cumulatively over time, you can think of them as press alterations. On the other end of the spectrum are pulses or pulse events that you can think of these as abruptly changing resources, again, directly or indirectly, but it's for a limited period of time, that pulse duration. And these are things like heat waves, deluges, ice storms, biomass altering disturbances, etc. So when we think of pulse versus press effects, the way I like to orient it is through this framework that myself and Alan Knapp and Scott Collins published back in 2009 in Ecology. Is that you think oftentimes that historically we've always thought about pulses being those events that are few within a generation of whatever species are in the system you're studying, and few across generations or years. And those are the ones that you think of like historically were important kind of disturbances, like um, fire um, and things like that. And humans are pushing systems out of this kind of entrained pulse area into, for example, the chronic press situation where we have many resource pulses both within and among years, and essentially it becomes a continuous cumulative effect, like in nitrogen deposition or elevated CO2. But then we're also pushing systems to have more events within a generation, but few between, for example, through droughts and things like that, or we're just increasing the frequency of disturbances on a yearly basis or between generations. And that's just where we could think about fire increasing in frequency or um, ice storms becoming more frequent, et cetera. But although you could think about those as extreme weather events as well. So anyway, the idea is that we can think about this kind of continuum between pulse and chronic, but there's also this kind of these other ends of the spectrum, ranging from many within to many among years. And when we think about kind of the historical perspective on natural disturbances, you know, often they were these biomass disturbing events, right? And that would release resources and then in turn feedback to affect biota over time. With global changes and these press alterations, we're directly altering resources. That's impacting biota and again feeding back. And so when you think about pulse versus press, you know, is it the disruption of biota that's influencing resources, or are we directly impacting resources? And many of the global change drivers are directly impacting them. Although, like I mentioned, there's some that indirectly do that as well. Just following along on this, the press alterations and the framework that we came up with in our 2009 paper, the idea behind that is that you have some kind of ecosystem response and this change in resources over time. And the expectation is that you might just get this gradual change over time or a response over time in the ecosystem, or you might have something that's more punctuated in its response. And we hypothesized that would be driven by kind of a hierarchy of mechanisms, ranging from those kind of fast responses at the individual level to ones that require compositional change or reordering of species in the community, to those that actually require both the immigration of new species or the loss of species. And so you might expect that over time, you get the individual response, and there's a lag in a response until you start to get shifts in abundances of species, get a lag, and then an even larger response when you start to get loss and gain of species. And here, you might have this scenario D is where you might have really long-lived species like in forests, so that you don't really see the changes, but that nonlinearity is somewhere in the future. Or you have something like E, where you might have species loss and gain occurring concurrently with species compositional changes. And of course, you might have all three of these occurring simultaneously. And there's actually evidence recently from a paper by Meg Navolio and colleagues that suggests that actually you can find all three occurring simultaneously in many systems. Needless to say, the idea is that these nonlinearities in ecosystem response are expected to occur over time with press alteration resources. And the magnitude of ecosystem response should vary depending on what mechanisms of change are occurring in the system. So, this is what we hypothesize with press changes in resources, or these global change drivers that are presses. But what about pulses? What kind of responses are expected there? And to first orient ourselves, I'm going to rely on this paper by Anke Jens and Peter White that came out in 2019 in Ecology, where they characterized pulses and the dynamics that might result. And they focused on kind of key characteristics of pulses, which are the magnitude, here shown in the x-axis in this upper row, the abruptness here shown where you have something where you have background variability, and then you get more pulsy systems as you increase both magnitude and abruptness. Periodicity, which is like how often does it happen, maybe with respect to the long-term record. That's how I interpreted it. And so here you might have background variability here, but then when you move beyond that, as the magnitude increases, maybe the periodicity is less often, like volcanism, for example. And then the fourth feature was frequency, and where again you have background variability, but as you increase magnitude, the expectation is that the frequency of those pulses should decline. And all of these kind of axes of variation can result in a response such as depicted in this bottom row, where you have the system greater the magnitude, the larger the loss in function, and maybe the greater abruptness. And then it may take time for the system return to pre-pulse conditions. And then here they're just showing like you might get something like that's lesser magnitude. You get much more rapid return to pre-pulse conditions. And finally, the third scenario they talked about where you might have actually overlapping pulses in resources that could be creating quite interesting dynamics in the system. So we've got some good theoretical understanding there and hypotheses about what might be expected from pulses. But I thought I'd give an example of the effect of just that first key characteristic of pulse events, which is magnitude, and use deluges, which are these kind of large and discrete rainfall events that can be quite large. And in fact, forecast climate change is predicted to increase the size and magnitude and frequency of deluge events in the future. And we're already seeing a signature of that in the record. So this is an example from the shortgrass steppe ecosystem in Colorado. And this is a study conducted by Allison Post and Alan Knapp, where they looked at different size deluges based on the long-term record, and tried to impose deluges that were quite normal to quite extreme. So they range from 20 millimeters to up to 120 millimeter event. And what they found was, they measured soil moisture, volumetric water content, and these deluges were applied mid-season during the growing season. And what you can see is that in all cases with those deluges, you saw a dramatic and abrupt increase in soil moisture. And then how long that soil moisture remained elevated differed depending on how large the deluge event was. And so they, based on this kind of range of deluge sizes, they then looked at a number of different ecosystem responses to see what effect these pulse events had. And what I'll show here is soil CO2 efflux, canopy greenness, and leaf area per tiller. And what you'll see is that, in case of CO2, again, it was quite abrupt in its response, whereas leaf area kind of lagged and was much more, really only saw a big bump with the larger rainfall events. And when you look averaged over that kind of period of responsiveness in which soil moisture was elevated, what they saw is that with increasing deluge size, they saw a linear increase in all of these responses here. And by the end of the season, what they found was also above and below ground production, their responses increased as deluge size increased as well, although there was quite a bit of variability. But the upshot from this is that magnitude does matter. The size of the event increased the size of the ecosystem response. And so I think this is a really cool example of the way in which we can begin to kind of understand that important axis of variation of pulse events and the role it plays in influencing ecosystem responses. And in this case, it was just a single year pulse event, right? And so a lot of she didn't find any kind of compositional changes in the plant community, but she did see large increases in ecosystem responses. What's interesting about these pulse events as well, particularly with respect to deluges, is that these can vary, especially in semi-arid areas. Where deluges occur can vary spatially, which is really cool. And I know Alan Knapp is going to talk more about this in his talk tomorrow. But I just wanted to mention that, these kind of pulse events can vary across space and time. And by varying across time, they might be creating these kind of hot moments, like I showed you with the elevated CO2, really large amplitude response, and then a pretty rapid decline in that increased elevated soil respiration response. But what's really interesting and cool about them is they could potentially also create hotspots in space. If you have spatial variation where these convective storms occur, you might get really interesting responses spatially that you really wouldn't capture potentially in a modeling framework. But these are the kind of responses that we do want to capture. And I'll just show you an example of this. This is from the shortgrass steppe, where you see this, this is where a deluge occurred, and it was a hot spot in space in the sense that there was this really deep recharge in water due to this deluge event that occurred in just one area of the shortgrass steppe site, but not in other areas. But getting back to kind of the other things that might be important about pulse events, and one is timing. In particular, in the short grass steppe, timing could matter quite a bit in how it influences ecosystem responses, and it certainly could be an important factor influencing the impacts of pulses in general. And so I just wanted to continue on with this example of deluges. And with this second study, Allison Post and Alan Knapp looked at when do these deluge events occur most frequently in the historic past, and they found they occurred mainly in July. And so they wanted to impose these deluge, a same size deluge event, either early, mid, or late in the growing season. And in all cases, you can see that each of those elevates soil moisture in similar ways, with about a 28-day increase in soil moisture over time. But timing really mattered, even though soil moisture was elevated similarly among the three timed deluge events. Soil CO2 efflux responded differently. So the biggest bump in soil efflux was soil CO2 efflux was in July versus August or June. And similarly, the same with canopy greenness, leaf length per tiller, and flowering stalk density. All were higher, or tended to be higher with that mid-season deluge when they actually occurred historically. And then when you look at productivity, the biggest increase, at least above ground, was with the mid-season deluge event. So timing of these pulsed events matter as well. And so getting back to like what should we expect with these kind of pulse events, we know, there's probably at least from the deluges, I show both magnitude and timing matters, and we know that from other kind of pulse events that magnitude can matter quite a bit, for example, with disturbances. But what we know less about are these other factors, such as how abrupt does it have to be, how often does it need to occur with respect to long-term record, and then what about if we get multiple co-occurring pulses, or these pulse events occurring more frequently in the future? What impacts are they going to have on ecosystems? I think one of the more important and I think interesting questions is about pulse-press interactions. And here, again, we look across that continuum. We know that each of these are not occurring in isolation. They're being superimposed on each other and occurring simultaneously. And so when we go back to that HRF framework, where we might see this kind of dynamic play out over time with a chronic press, what happens if we impose pulses there? We may get really large changes in ecosystem response where we might expect, if we didn't have that pulse, maybe those changes would not occur for a long time. For example, in the forest, if we have a chronic change in resources, but then we have a superimposed on that a really large ice storm, that might actually make the response much larger than you would expect with each in isolation. So with pulse press interactions, we may expect that these large ecosystem responses will become the norm, and they may not require some of these these longer term changes in mechanisms playing out over time. Maybe they'll be much more rapidly enhanced and advanced in systems. And just an example of this is a study that we're getting going soon, funded by DOE, where we're looking at the interaction of drought and deluges. And the idea behind that is that we may just see non-additive effects of drought and deluges, or we may see something that's additive, or even creating these really interesting hot moments in time. And so this is one goal of ours, is to get at how, with a press longer term drought, how these kind of pulsed deluge events might actually rescue these systems from the negative effects of a drought, for example. So what don't we know? I would say that we're just starting to scratch the surface on climate pulses in particular. For example, heat waves, flash droughts, deluges, ice storms. I know we're hearing about ice storms and heat waves, but um, we really, we've really only just begun to scratch the surface, I would say. We know little about the relative importance of different characteristics of pulse events on ecosystem response. For example, I think we know a lot more about magnitude, but what about some of those other factors like timing, periodicity, amplitude, and things like that? Um, but we're accumulating knowledge about pulse-press interactions, but we need to do more, particularly with respect to climate pulses and climate presses, or in deposition in these climate pulses, or elevated CO2 in climate pulses are these discrete disturbance events. So with that, I will wrap it up, and I thank you again for your attention.